We welcome you and thank you for joining us for Indigo Shy Library's 2020 National Science Week online presentation. Indigo Shy Libraries acknowledges Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the original custodians of the lands, waterways and skies across Australia. We thank you for sharing and caring for the land that we learn and play on. We pay respects to elders and we share our friendship and kindness. This event has been made possible through our coordination with and professional guidance provided by Museums Victoria, the Royal Society of Victoria and the Libraries Victoria. We thank them for their help. Now, most importantly, it is our privilege and pleasure to introduce our guest presenter, Professor Saul Cunningham, the Director of the Fenner School of Environment and Society at ANU. Professor Cunningham has an extensive background in the fields of zoology and ecology, and whilst working with the CSIRO, he developed a research program focusing on the challenge of maintaining biodiversity in landscapes dedicated to agricultural production. In 2015, Professor Cunningham was awarded the Australian Ecology Research Award. Our thanks are extended to Professor Cunningham for his support for our Indigo Libraries program, and we hope you really enjoy his presentation.
So you can see in this picture here a honeybee visiting the flower of an apple tree, something you might have seen in your own garden. And it's a visual representation of I think the way most people understand the importance of pollination. The honeybee is an important pollinator and it plays a role in helping us to produce the food that we eat. So honeybees are important as crop pollinators. You can see in this image here, so this is in Western Victoria where we have massive orchards producing almonds. You can see that to make sure that all of those many thousands of trees, hundreds of thousands of trees, we have to put out thousands of beehives to make sure there's enough bees out in that environment to make sure that these almond trees get pollinated. If you don't have bees in an almond orchard, then you don't get any nuts. So we know that pollination matters to food production. And we know it matters to about 3/4 of all the different things we grow for food. So not all food requires pollination, but about 3/4 of the different kinds of plants that we grow for food need some kind of pollination to really get the best possible production. But I want to talk a little bit more about pollination of wild plants by different kinds of insects. So instead of this honeybee here, we're talking about native bees that interact with wild plants. So here is a grassland with beautiful wildflowers in spring, and this is an environment where you might expect to see bees moving from flower to flower, and they play a role in making sure that these beautiful flowering plants make seed and reproduce. And I think people often, when you hear the word flower, they picture a big beautiful flower like this, but actually there's all sorts of kinds of flowers and some of them are small and boring. And flowering plants aren't always these little things on the ground. Flowering plants can be trees, and I'll get to that in a minute. So here's a picture of a beautiful native bee on a native wild plant, a bluebell, a Wallenbergia. So the European honeybee is just one bee, and its native range is in Europe and North Africa, and it's been moved all around the world to play a role in pollination. But there's at least 20,000 other species of wild bee around the world. And here in Australia, we've got probably 2,000. We don't even know for sure because not enough people study these bees. And here's an example of a native bee. This one's smaller than the European honeybee. Most of them are. And this is a native bee pollinating a Wallenbergia flower. But as I was saying before, it's not just little flowers on the ground, it's trees. Australia is unusual in that we have this group of trees, the eucalyptus that you all know, that are beautiful and that are so important in the landscape. And this group of trees requires pollinators, insect pollinators, but also some non-insect pollinators to make sure it produces enough seed. If you go to Europe or North America, the dominant trees in the landscape there are wind pollinated. They don't need insects and birds and so on to be pollinated. They just need the wind, like pine trees do in Australia. But the eucalyptus, which you know is so important, is an animal pollinated tree. So when we talk about the importance of pollination, it's not just food crops and it's not just beautiful flowers in a grassland, but it's the most important trees in our landscape in Australia. Acacia too, so those yellow flowers that you would know, the blossom of acacia, again, is an insect attracting flower. So Australia is unusual for how important this animal pollination is for some of our most important species. And it's not only insects that are doing the pollination. So in this image here, you can see one of the researchers here at the ANU holding a regent honeyeater. And they're working on regent honeyeater because it's one of the endangered birds in Australia. But it represents this big group of many different honeyeater species that you would know, again, from your gardens or from bird watching in your local area. Honeyeaters visit a wide range of different Australian plants. And again, that's unusual. If you were to go to Europe and North America, you don't see birds visiting flowers that much, because birds on flowers is elsewhere in the world is a sort of a tropical phenomenon. But in Australia, this idea of having birds visiting flowers and pollinating plants is spread across the whole country, and we're really lucky for that, and for this diversity of beautiful birds that are supported by this. And then it gets even weirder. In Australia, we have things like this pygmy possum that will also visit flowers at night, so you don't see it so often. But they'll visit to collect nectar and pollen. And this idea of something it's not a bee, it's not a bird, it's a whole other thing again, playing a role in pollination, again, is something that's a bit weird about Australia. A little bit less weird are bats, so flying mammals play a role in pollination around the world, including in Australia. So the importance of pollination is that these insect-pollinated plants, the crops we grow, but also so many of our wild plants, about 80% of our wild plants need animal pollination. And they need it to make sure they produce seed. So without pollination, they'll produce less seed or in some cases even no seed. But it's not just about the number of seed they produce, it's actually about the genetic variability of that seed. So pollinators move pollen from plant to plant, which means they're moving genes from plant to plant. And that makes sure that there's variability in the offspring. Okay, so the seeds are not all the same, the seeds are all a little bit different, and we'll grow plants that are a little bit different. And that's essential to giving plants the opportunity to adapt to change. You need that variation in the seeds to make sure that our plants can adapt to environmental change. So as we live in a world that's changing, if we want to make sure that our wild plants can continue to reproduce and continue to adapt to change, we need pollinators in our environment. In Australia, we need those 2,000 species of wild bees, and we need these beautiful honeyeaters, and even things like this pygmy possum all playing a role in pollination.